Last time I made a commitment that I was going to explore some facets of what divorce is like. So I will do that today, and I will talk about my personal divorce, and I will talk about the divorcing system and what people go through if they elect to move on and get a divorce. It's quite a challenge, and I'll note some of the pitfalls and some of the difficulties. And I'm happy to do this because sadly enough, or maybe wisely enough, about half the marriages made in the United States do wind up in divorce finally. And certainly, as mental health professionals, those of you who are watching this know how many times you're called upon to intervene or work with somebody or a couple who's in real trouble and in real pain, and often that can eventuate in a decision that gets made that the relationship is going to end. So it's a topic of great interest, not only to us who try to work with those who are hurting, but with people in general in the culture who have to confront the fact that they may be in a relationship that's becoming untenable. With regard to my own marriage, on a scale of 1 to 10, it was maybe a 5 or 6 in terms of the unpleasantness and challenge and toxicity of the whole thing. It started off weirdly enough. I finally found the courage to leave and had gotten myself an apartment that I moved into. But uh, this did not surprise me. The woman who was becoming my former wife was really angry, hurt, and outraged. The way she talked to me after the separation suggested that I had violated a very sacred covenant, that I was to remain in her life for the rest of her life, and that I was a terrible human being because I had decided not to. I was worse than terrible. I was inexcusable, and I was violating, from her perspective, some sacred duty of being around to respond to her, to care about her, and to provide for her. Uh, I had my own guilt about leaving. I had bad guilt about leaving my children, and I had bought in. That had been one of the textures of our marriage all along. That she was troubled, she was chaotic, and that she was hurting, that she was hypochondriacal, and I was to soothe her, watch over her, and try and redeem her in some way. Those were the assignments in the marriage, and I had finally gotten burned out and decided I didn't want that responsibility anymore, or it didn't make for a flow between the two of us that was mutual and mutually caring and mutually caretaking. It was a strange one-way street that I was failing at over and over again from her perspective. So I didn't want any part of it finally, and I finally got the courage to leave. But she was still outraged that I had done so. I was really awful. When I think back about that, think about many other clients and reflect about the culture, what I'm describing is not at all surprising. I think what we get imprinted with is that marital relationships are somehow sacred. We take them to church or to synagogue often. We have them sanctified in front of the Lord. So it is a holy obligation that's impressed upon us. And even though those of us who become agnostic or atheist or develop other kinds of values and beliefs that are more rational, still have the early training that's poured into us by the culture as part of us. So all of us suffer, I think. If we break certain relationships, that is really not to be countenanced very well. Uh, if you're an ungrateful child and don't want to have anything to do with your parents anymore, that is really terribly stigma making. If you are a parent and reject a child and you cast them out into the universe and have nothing further to do with them, that's horribly stigmatizing too. Those are behaviors you don't do. So the breaking up of a marriage is on that list of things that are not to be done. So if a marriage is to be broken, then a struggle starts. The struggle is, who is the bad person? Somebody is very bad if a marriage is breaking up. And the couple frequently go back and forth between who is the bad person that's causing the trouble. As a therapist, I can tell you I frequently get to bear witness to a particularly upsetting struggle. Two people come in and they say that their marriage is in trouble and they want to do anything possible and everything possible to make it more vital and more meaningful again, but they're full of blaming. It's always the other person's fault, and they take great pains to try and portray to the therapist why the other person is damaged, impossible, crazy, vicious, violent, whatever it is that makes the other person an untenable partner, while they themselves, of course, are the sensible one and the caring one and the one who's prepared to forgive sins and make goodness happen and endure forever. They don't want to break up. Often we're called upon as mental health professionals to try and get people to come apart. We see the futility of what they're doing. And in order for them to come apart, somebody has to lead. Somebody has to be willing to be the bitch or the bastard who's the evil one who says, I'm not going to put up with that anymore and I'm leaving. And then the other person can be the poor, forlorn one who says, I tried everything. I even went to counseling. I did whatever he said he needed from me. And that son of a bitch still left me anyhow. And they play the martyr role and the victim role. Now, both of those roles stink. It's awful to be a bitch or a bastard who's doing violence and an evil act. And it's awful to be a forlorn person who gets abandoned and thrown away. By temperament and by early life experience, we are bent in one or the other directions, and we're willing to embrace one or the other of those roles. But couples are in trouble when both of them want to be the martyr who gets left. They can get stuck for many, many months, even years, and without even noticing it, they become more and more horrible, hoping they can provoke the other person finally to say, I've had enough and I'm getting out of there, so that they can then embrace the martyr role. It's quite a challenge as a psychologist to manage those kinds of relationships and lead them to any better outcome. One of the simplest ways I've hit upon is simply to announce to both of them that I'll take the responsibility. I've done my assessment. There's no way that this marriage can be brought to anything better than it is now. As a matter of fact, it's only going to deteriorate and get more and more hurtful to both of them. And I'm ordering both of them to start a trial separation so they can begin to experience what it's like if they don't have to contend with each other on a daily basis. So I'm willing to step in the breach and be the catalyst for change if neither one of them can find the courage to do that. Back to my own personal story. What was most startling to me, well, yes and no. I never knew, I'm backing up and starting the sentence over. I knew about my own infidelity. I never knew for sure whether my former wife was also experimenting with infidelity. I had my suspicions. I even had my hope. I wouldn't have to feel as guilty about what I was doing if she too were doing the same thing. But I never hired a detective. I never even asked her. I just assumed that this was not unlikely. But I must say I was startled. 6 weeks after I moved out of the house and I was still reeling in dislocation and some confusion, she was living with another man. She had moved somebody else in with her. And I thought to myself, my God, am I that easily replaced? And for sure, I started to think she didn't just meet him and have him come live there. They must have had some kind of ongoing relationship. I don't know if it was a sexual affair or not, but they must have known each other and built some kind of affinity for each other for some period of time. I didn't think she was crazy enough or a fool to invite a stranger to come move in just because there was space in the house and it would be nice to have a man around the house. So I had to assume that he was somebody familiar to her. So one of the things that started to grind on me was, what was the implication of this? There was already another man there for what was going to happen to my children and what was going to happen to my divorce negotiations with her. She couldn't hide from me that there was another man there. I don't even think she made any attempt to, because the children were going back and forth between the two households, and that's how I learned about another man being there to begin with. Ed's living with us now, my son said. I didn't know who the hell Ed was. Who is Ed that's living with you? Oh my God. By the way, I'm not enjoying revisiting any of this. It's not one of my favorite pastimes. I, of course, soon after I moved out, I retained the services of an attorney. And my former wife had a nice attorney. He had been taking care of her. She was ahead of me on the road. She was about 7 months into divorce negotiations when I finally left home. So he was available to service me too, and I hired him. And knowing myself, I made a strange announcement to him. I said, I feel horrible. I feel so guilty. I feel guilty about breaking up my family. I feel guilty about leaving my children. I feel guilty about not being my wife's caretaker anymore. I'm afraid. I would like to have this over with too. I don't like the process of being in divorce negotiations. I'd like to get it over with. So please protect me. I will be tempted to give away 70 times more than I need to settle for in order to massage my guilt and get the divorce over with as quickly as possible. Don't let me hurt myself too badly in the process. You can let me veer somewhat in that direction, but don't let me veer too far off so I wind up with great bitterness years from now about I gave away much too much for no good reason. So he laughed at me and said, I'll take reasonable care of you. But I believe in settling things too. I would like to get this passed. So now let me make a comment on the institution of divorce as it exists in most places in the country. I know California law very well because I live in California. I'm not as expert on what may be the variations on this in other places. But there are certain assumptions that go on, I think, in most venues, and all of them have problems with them. One assumption is that the parents who are separating from each other, if there are children, will be civil to each other, and for the benefit of the children will work out arrangements for how the children can be arranged, so-called co-parenting arrangements that both of them will endorse, and they won't be in any kind of struggle or protracted battle for what patterns of visitation and residence will be, what the legal responsibility toward the children is of the two parents, and on and on. Now, that is a hopeless hope. I don't believe in making any serious attempt to work out co-parenting arrangements. If the parents could be respectful towards each other and come to kind agreements on behalf of children and manage that with an absence of great turbulence or great bitterness or great fighting, they probably wouldn't be getting a divorce in the first place. It's not people who can do those things who get divorces from each other. As a matter of fact, the most likely thing that happened to the children after the separation takes place is both parents will start a competition for the trophy. They want the allegiance, understanding, and compassion of the children, because if they get that, it proves the other person was the fucked up and evil one. And the testimony of the children's allegiance is proof that the other person was the fucked up one. So what has to happen, I think, in many more cases, and even the law says that parents shall be encouraged to develop working co-parenting plans. I am a big fan of separate parenting plans. I'm a big fan of a relationship where the parents don't have to, former parents to separated parents, whatever you want to call them, don't even have to talk to each other. They've come to some agreement about where the children are going to live when, and when the children will be visiting with the other person. And that's been archived as part of their divorce settlement finally. So they have an agreement in place, and they should just shut up. If the parents, if the children start complaining about what's going on in the other house, they should not call the other parent immediately and say, your child is complaining that you're doing X, Y, and Z, and what are you doing anyhow? And I want to know what's really going on in that household. They should shut up. What they should say to the child is, oh, I'm sorry it's unpleasant for you there. You need to screw up your courage, and you need to tell your father, you need to tell your mother that this is something that's happening that you don't like. We can practice. You can practice telling me about what you need to say to your other parent, but you have to advocate for yourself. I'm separated from that person. I'm divorced now. I'm not part of the loop. You have to take on the responsibility of learning how to live with them and how to negotiate with them and how to advocate for yourself when you're unhappy with when things go awry in the household. If the other parent calls you when the children are with you and says, I don't like what you're feeding my child, you know he has a gluten allergy and you need to be more careful about that, and starts giving you instructions how to parent your own child, please say, you know, I'm a parent too, and you have no advice for me about what I do with this child in this house. So please, thank you for being troubled, and we're not going to talk about this. There are only two things we ever have to talk about. If there's a change in some financial circumstances, so our financial arrangement with each other has to be altered, I will be happy to begin the discussion of that with you. And if you're unavailable at some time when you're scheduled to be with the children and other plans have to make made because you're unavailable, yes, turbulence in visitation and a need to change a visitation plan, of course I'll talk to you about that. Because I have in the divorce decree, I have the right of first refusal. And if you're not going to be available at some time while the child is supposed to be with you, please call me and I'll let you know if I'm going to take them or take him, or I'm going to have to refuse because I'm busy too. And then you're going to be stuck having to get a babysitter. I'm not your babysitter. And so those are kind of the elements of single parenting. No advice giving back and forth, no attempt to control what goes on in the other household, no scolding for things, no advocating for the children when the child's upset with a particular parent. Divorce is about letting go. The sad fact, and it's encouraged by co-parenting arrangements or attempts, the sad fact is people who get a divorce get a legal divorce. They're no longer legally attached to each other or financially attached to each other, but they keep carrying on their bad marriage. They keep carrying on their disputes, their arguments, the way they curse at each other. They do it over the children since they don't have the marriage to do it over anymore. And if you're a therapist working with that, it's quite a challenge to get them to give that up and stop it and tell them the end process of a creative and good divorce is silence. The relationship is over. There is no residual relationship that goes on. The daydream will all go to La La Land together and be present at each other's significant events, and we'll be happy with each other and happy to see each other, and it's going to be wonderful. Is a small myth. Yes, in a tiny, tiny percentage of cases, people are built in some way that they can pull that off and do that. But to advocate for that or attempt to make that happen is a fool's errand as far as I'm concerned. And I had that in spades. My over anxious former wife was constantly calling the house and scolding me for doing something wrong. She didn't like the sleeping arrangement in my house. She didn't like the diet I was putting the kids on. She didn't like the toys I got for them. And I could have had endless fights with her. For instance, she took great pleasure in having the kids come visit me with soiled, dirty clothes on, knowing that I would either have to give them other clothes to wear or I would have to do the laundry for her. And that was a constant irritant. So we decided we were going to have separate but equal. We got the children wardrobes of their own that remained in our house and didn't go home with them again. And they changed into the clothes we had for them when they arrived at our place. Uh, I okay, I'm gonna fork in the road. The the financial wait back then there was not a lot of arguing about custody and visitation. Back then, it was presumed that children under 18 would live with their mothers. That was the presumption of the law. There was no 50-50 plan that was being advocated in the courts. It was if children were still minors, they were to live with their mothers. And under the model contract that the court wanted to endorse, fathers were to be given customary visitation rights, unspecified. What the hell were customary visitation rights? Uh, my wife insisted that I be allowed to visit, my former wife insisted I be allowed to visit the children every other weekend. That's what she wanted to initiate. And we started arguing about that from the beginning. I was feeling terrible about having abandoned them. I didn't want to be an every other weekend dad. I thought that would make me like some kind of grandparent or kind uncle who would see the children occasionally and would make Christmas for them on the day I was with them because I could indulge them because they were visiting with me. I would have no real role as a parent to speak of if that's all I saw them was 2 weekends a month. So we negotiated it up to 3 weekends a month plus Wednesday evenings. They would come and stay over and sleep over in my house Wednesday evenings and be returned. So I could at least talk to them about homework, have them in the middle of their ordinary week's routines. I did not want any kind of 50-50 routine, even though it was just being experimented with back then. I thought it was terrible to turn the kids into ping pong balls, bouncing back and forth on what kind of ritual? Every other day were they going to bounce back and forth between two houses? Was it half a week here and half a week there? None of those arrangements felt good to me. It was too disruptive. So I was willing to step back and not have them 50% of the time if I could have them one evening overnight and every other weekend. So I would have some weekends free and she would have some weekends free. And that's where we finally negotiated things. The negotiations about money turned out to be more complex. Uh, she was entitled supposedly to lifetime alimony. And fortunately, she was subject to her own streaks of guilt. And she knew that she was at some risk. The courts were not, I think in many states, it's now moved up from remarriage terminates lifetime alimony to cohabitation with another partner, even if it's only for a temporary period of time. I think cohabitation that goes on for 2 weeks is the statute in some places. And she knew that if she was going to get serious with this guy and even think about marrying him, she would be confronted with giving up her alimony. And then while we were still arguing and debating all of this, she made a mistake under California law. She went to Hawaii, and I heard from the kids where she was going, what hotel she was staying at, and I heard from the babysitter where I could get in touch with her if there was an emergency and I needed to get in touch with her. I got the name of the hotel and the hotel phone number. And then I was creative. I called up and said, I'm checking on a possible guest. Do you have a Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so? I had learned his last name, residing with you. I may need to get in touch with them. Are they in your hotel? Yes, they were there registered as husband and wife. Well, that was a clear violation of the current California regulation. And my lawyer threatened that we were going to drag her into court and get her to testify about that visit. And we were going to subpoena him too and see if he was making financial contributions to the household. And if she really wanted to litigate the lifetime alimony decree, we would do that. But we expected her to just terminate her demand for lifetime alimony because she had violated the statute at this point. And she stopped, and that dropped away. And there were only niggling arguments about, was I lying about my financial declaration? Was she lying about her financial declaration? But we came to some closure. And talk about being magnanimous. On the day I separated from them, and there was no argument between us, what was the date of separation? Because that was the date on which I was no longer responsible for any of her debts, and she was no longer responsible for any of my debts. And we were not having an argument about that. Well, I had some assets that were pending. I had some people who were in debt to me. The people who were in debt to me were my clients who owed me money as of the date of separation. So any money that they were, she was entitled to half of whatever my clients owed me on the date of separation. So I had to keep a whole separate bookkeeping system for several months, tracking the coming in of slow payments from clients, because I had to give her half of them. And damn it, I honored that. That was what the court ordered in response to an agreement we made. I kept my agreement. She got 2 checks from me every month. She got child support that was eventually set by the court. And she got half of whatever niggling amounts of money I had collected from those clients as of the end of the month. My I thought my trips to the court on behalf of trying to get separated and divorced had come to closure on the day the final settlement agreement was entered. And it had been so long we could actually pick up the actual divorce decrees themselves, because it had been over 6 months since the petition for divorce had been filed. No, it was not the last time I was in court. My wife still wanted to punish me for leaving her. So around the anniversary of my leaving, it was in a June I left. On the anniversary, somewhere in late May or early June of the next 2 successive years, she hauled me back into court. She wanted to change something about the visitation agreement, or about the money I was paying her, the child support agreement, or there was an extra something she wanted to add on. She wanted to make me, she would plead poor and want to make me pay for private schooling for the children when we had been splitting that cost. She was going to plead poor and say she could no longer do it any further. My present wife's wisdom said, she just wants to talk to you. And that's the only forum in which she can see you and talk to you, because you're not having anything to do with her anymore. In order to stop the barrage of phone calls and notes being sent to the house, because my former wife was objecting to something we were doing. She didn't approve. We were taking them on a vacation. She had to know where. She didn't approve of the place we were taking them on the vacation, and she wanted to tell me what list of vacations she had were acceptable destinations for the children. That kind of thing she was harassing me with over and over and over again. And Hermine, my wife, came up with the creative solution. Write her a letter. You only have to do this one time. Formally notify her that she had a choice. She can communicate to me through her attorneys. She could talk to her attorney, and he would talk to my attorney, and my attorney would bring to my attention whatever the dispute was about, and she could communicate with me in that way. But short of a real emergency, that she had had a heart attack, or one of the kids was in the hospital, She was to leave me alone and not talk to me. I would not comment or talk to her about any topic. I would hear about it through my attorney, or if she wanted to save attorney fees, because I would not be responsible for her attorney fees, she could call my house or send a note to my new wife. Hermine would be happy to discuss the dispute with her and try to negotiate some wonderful solution. And she went bonkers when I said that was the way she was going to contact me. She called up and left messages on me on voicemail. I wouldn't answer. I wouldn't talk to her. Hermine would answer the phone when she saw who was calling and said, "Is this you?" "Well, I'm here. What's the problem? What do you want to talk to him about?" And then she would get cursed at, and the phone would be slammed down in rage. And after she found out that her rage got her nowhere and she couldn't do anything, she tried the first few times to use her lawyer. She didn't like getting a bill for the service. And finally, my present wife was the only one she talked to when there had to be some kind of change. But she could get me back in court, see me, and have to hear my voice and be in my presence if she took me back to court again. So I think my wife is right. That's probably why we went back to court, because she lost. We went 2 times, and each time she wound up worse than she had been than if she hadn't gone to court. And I think she got the message and stopped doing that. Then there was utter silence between her and me the rest of our lives together. When there were rare times where something had to be tweaked or some information had to be given, she would talk to Hermine and have to deal with Hermine. And it was obvious she hated every minute of that, but she had been painted in a corner and had no choice. So to those of you who are citizens just listening to this, here are some tools you might consider using if you're in a bind. And to those of you in my profession, those are some tools you can pass on to your clients. Now I will return to general problems with the family law court. For all its attempt to honor what the mission of the family court is, namely looking out for the best interests of the children. That is usually the overarching charge in most states of why there's a family law court. It is for the benefit of children. It isn't that at all. Judges have their own predilections. They tend to be bent towards favoring husbands or favoring fathers in this case, or favoring mothers in this case. They have their own idiosyncrasies. And in addition, there are other important players in the court system, namely the lawyers that have been retained by the two parties. Now, lawyers are sworn to represent the best interests of their clients, but we are always subject to economic temptations. And as a matter of fact, lawyers make out best when there's a lot of arguing going on between the two parties, and when divorces drag out for longer and longer periods of time. They have many more billable hours than if they can facilitate a speedy resolution of the disputes between the parties. Now, there are what I considered very humane and honorable lawyers. They are not the majority of the people who practice family law. People who practice family law want to be advocates. They want to make sure, partly because they don't want to be sued for malpractice. They want to make sure they were vigorous advocates of the positions of their clients, and that they got every penny out of the system that they possibly could for their clients. And they didn't neglect to bring up every issue that might have advantaged their clients. So for malpractice reasons and for personal greed reasons, if you're lost in the bowels of the family court, it's going to cost you large sums of money. Uh, there are some public people, some lawyers who contribute some public time to those who are near the poverty level to try and take up domestic family law matters, but you can't count on having one. And please be prepared to spend thousands of dollars if you decide to get a divorce. I don't think there's any way around it. And it gets more complicated. If the fighting gets intense, then one or another of the attorneys or the judge himself will get another lawyer involved. They'll say nobody's adequately representing the needs of the child, and I'm confused, and therefore I'm going to appoint an attorney for the children from a roster of attorneys I know that serve that function. And now you have a third attorney who thinks that he's the uber parent and he knows best what's good for the children, and he fights with one another, the other attorneys, and he fights with the litigant, and he advertises the judge to do outrageous things because he knows as the attorney for the children that that's what's in the best interest of the children. So that's usually the last. Even after the divorce is final, the judge will sometimes keep the attorney for the children in place for some period of time afterwards, just as a safeguard in case the couple starts squabbling again. And usually you're stuck having to pay half the bills of of the attorney for the children. And that person wants to be very vigilant. So that person wants to interview teachers, wants to interview the parents, wants to interview chums, wants to interview families, other families who know the family. He will run up, or she will run up many, many, many billable hours trying to represent the interests of the children well. And then there's a fourth character that will come up. If you don't arrive at some reasonable settlement of the custody and visitation items in an expeditious fashion, the judge, you'll petition the judge to keep making the decisions if there are disputes go on between the two of you. But after the first time you try that with the judge will duck because the judge doesn't want to piss you off and the judge doesn't want to be hated. So the judge will tell you it's time for you to pick a child custody evaluator to deal with all these serious questions of difference you have between the two of you. And he will depend upon the recommendations of the evaluator when these matters have to be decided. And now you're into somewhere between 6 months to a year further hell having to deal with a child custody evaluator. And I would think the ballpark figure in Los Angeles, California now is that's an $80,000 bill that's going to come in from the child custody evaluator if you want to continue having a dispute about custody and visitation issues, about private school versus public school issues, about what religion the child should be raised in, if any, and what role should grandparents play in the children's lives. Anything you can think about fighting about, that will get thrown into the lap of the child custody evaluator. And as the attorney for the child will want to do, the child custody evaluator is going to want to be very, very thorough about this whole matter and doesn't want to be sued for malpractice because it's usually a mental health professional who's in the child custody evaluation role. And doesn't, by the way, usually people who are child custody evaluators have to pay a higher malpractice premium when this is found out that this is an area in which they're practicing, because our malpractice insurance carriers know that they're a much higher risk of some kind of report to the board or malpractice suit being brought against us by one or the other of the parents is unhappy with the content of the reports and feel the custody evaluator has been tilted erroneously in favor of one of the parents to the detriment of the other parent. Oh my God. It's a shark infested tank that you get to swim in if you get into this kind of divorce. Oh, if you're simply a mental health practitioner who's attached to a client and the client goes into the courtroom, there are going to be pressures on you to try and do something. To please, in California, I think in most places, do not write any kind of document that offers a custody recommendation. So and so is a very good parent, or the child would be better off with one of the parties rather than the other. You're going to get in big trouble. You're going to get in trouble for with the court, and you're going to get in trouble with your malpractice carrier. Uh, try to resist being called into court if you possibly can. And do not give an opinion as to the capabilities to parent if you can't resist subpoenas and have to go to court in the end. Do not, if you're asked to give opinions about who is the better parent, resist. Do not, just keep saying over and over again, I'm not a recognized child custody evaluator. I'm not going to make comments on the suitability of either of these persons to be a parent. Uh, Final thing is your clients, if you're a mental health professional, your client is going to be asking you for advice about how to manage this. What do you think should happen? What are the dangers? I think I will end my visit today by reading something that's posted on my website. And by the way, my website is Arthur Kovacs, one word, all in small letters, .com. And there are some resources there. There's resources, one of them that I posted is about how to talk to children when the divorce is imminent. And what arrangements seem to calm them the most. But this is called What to Do If There Are Allegations and Actual Practices of Alienation. Because too many parents do want to capture the children if they possibly could. They want to be the parent that's seen as the good one. They revel in hearing stories of what's terrible in the other household. And they will continue to try in every way possible to get a child or children, even to repudiate the other parent. And there's literature now in our field of dubious empirical validation, but nevertheless, literature about what's called the alienated child syndrome. And if you have a client, your client may be seeing you or may have wound up feeling like the alienated parent because the children over and over again are throwing tantrums and rejecting the times when that client of yours is expected to be able to spend time with his or her children. So here is my comments on the reflections on the plight of the alienated child. When parents decide to separate and move on to divorce, courts across the country usually expect that they will somehow, quote, get along, unquote, for the benefit of their offspring. The assumption is that even after separation, they will work out arrangements for sharing custody, residence, and visitation, and they will cooperate harmoniously in making a whole variety of decisions about how their children should continue to be raised, what standards should be set for them, how they should be disciplined, what values they should learn, what expectations they should fulfill, and what future destiny they should be encouraged to embrace. Unfortunately, if such harmony and respectful cooperation were possible for many a divorcing couple, the pair probably would never have sought divorce in the first place. All too often, and in contrast to the court's hopes, divorce is accompanied by a large residue of anger and bitterness, in both who are separating. All too often, those who divorce continue to engage in irritable or even raging skirmishes, treat each other with contempt, with vengeance, and or with a search for vindication, have serious disputes about, quote, what the children need, close quotes, and in general continue on and on to carry out during the post-divorce period the miserable and distressing interactions with each other that led to divorce. In effect, a kind of war, mostly cold but intermittently hot as well, characterizes the post-divorce adjustment for far too many parents. Their offspring tragically become caught up in the war. In a humorous but yet chilling manner, the textures of such divorce outcomes have well been captured in Drew Barrymore's first film when she was a child, Irreconcilable Differences. In it, we see a loving relationship between two young adults, a union initially full of hope, playfulness, caring, and erotic transport, spiral downwards into competitiveness, enmity, and rage with changed life circumstances. After their separation, the parents demand for their daughter's loyalty, understanding, and companionship. And conversely, for their young daughter's pressure to reject the other parent, take a horrible toll on the offspring. The child protagonist in the film ends up petitioning the court to be allowed to separate from both her toxic parents and to be sent to live with her calm, steadfast, and loving nanny. For some portion of children caught in such miserable life circumstances, not infrequently, one of the outcomes that develops is a growing desire on the part of the child to repudiate one of the parents, to begin balking at visitation, and eventually to engage in open rebellion, absolutely refusing to honor the keeping in place of established and agreed upon times of residence in the two homes. The child chooses one parent and becomes increasingly hateful to the other. The possible patterns of parent to parent and parent to child interaction that generate such an outcome and what the rejected parent might do to ease the situation will be described in this paper. The seeds of alienation. By ways of coming to grip with my topic, let me note that 6 or more of 10 frequently recurring post-separating conditions seem to have come together in order for a child to become alienated from a parent. These dangerous interactions, if they add up and compound with each other, are poison. 1, ongoing enmity and bitterness between parents in the aftermath of separation and divorce. 2, attorneys for one or another of the parents filing actions related to custody, residence, or visitation with children that are experienced by the recipient as extremely vicious and critical. Typically, the motions of attorneys are like the firing of howitzers in an ongoing battle. 3, one or both of the parents openly expressing contempt, criticism, and or hatred of the other parent in front of the child. This is often amplified and supported by members of the critical parents' cohorts of friends and relatives. 4, overt or implied pressures from the parent who prevails in the struggle to capture the child, that the child be loyal to him or her and to adopt that person's worldview of what has happened and how terrible has been the parent who will be rejected. 5, the parent being rejected, having inflicted at least some serious wound or bitter disappointment on the child, who will now repudiate that parent. 7, as the ritual, oh no, I've lost track, they're just bullets here. As the rituals of visits are established, the parent who will be the capturing parent, wanting to talk often to the child during the periods when the child is visiting with the other parent, and he or she offering if available, if there's any trouble to the other home, inquiring whenever possible. Is there any trouble in the other home when the child is in visiting there? When the visit is concluded, the captured child interrogates the child about details of what transpired during the child's absence and making many derogatory comments about what is being described as the textures and parenting going on in the other house. The capturing parent never acknowledging that some conflict between persons spending time together is inevitable, and when there are disputes between the other parent and the child should work things out with the other parent. In extreme cases, the capturing parent filing unfounded child abuse charges against the to-be alienated parent. And finally, the parent coming into control of the child being convinced that the child's rejection of the other parent is understandable and acceptable, or even unfortunately, that it represents the best outcome for the young person. My years of experience in the literature in the field make it more than tragically clear that the biggest distress and most likely wounding feature of being a child of divorce is the trauma caused for the child by being trapped in painful and unsolvable loyalty conflicts. I have spent many hours in my consulting room listening to divorced parents and seeing their children. When so doing, I often find myself daydreaming about scenes from many motion pictures depicting the trench warfare of World War I. Each of the parents is hunkered down in his or her respective trenches, separated from each other by a no man's land. Machine gun fire is exchanged intermittently between the hardened positions. There are sudden bursts of shell fire. Periodically, poison gas is loosed across the battlefield. And all too often, one or both of the parents manage to self delude and, in absolute certainty, come to believe that their terrible actions are designed only for the best interests of their child or children. Rather than glimpsing that they are torturing their offspring, they manage to see themselves as advocates and liberators fighting for a better world. The children, unfortunately, are the ones who don't have a trench. They reside constantly in the no man's land between the two parties. Why does this happen? For far worse, we are all prisoners of culture. In this part of the world, and even more strongly if one is descended from families originating in many other, even more conservative societies, all of us have been trained from the earliest childhood to believe that marriages are sacred and that once such a commitment has been made, that marriages must endure until, quote, death do us part, unquote. Any person contemplating divorce, given the intensity of our moral training, must therefore inevitably experience painful surges of guilt and fear. The one who breaks up a family is facing stigma and ill regard from his or her friends and advocates. The fear and guilt are even greater if children are to be dislocated. So we end up doing two things to get our consciences off our back if we do divorce. We demonize our mates, focusing over and over again on our disappointments, our outrages, our note of bitterness, the clumsy and hurtful behavior, and the character flaws and foibles of those who have been our partners previously. Next, we lunge at the action of their allegiances if we can secure them, reassure us that we cannot, after all, be such terrible human beings if the testimony of their behavior is that they continue to love us and want to be with us. Two, in addition, if we are able to capture more of their loyalty, then can our former mates. This will prove to us and to the watching world that we are the good ones. Winning the battle for children's primary allegiance makes it obvious that we all know that all who know us, that our former male mate is indeed the one, the wretch, who fully deserves to have become divorced and abandoned parent. Finally, we often attempt to turn our children into our comfort sources. We make having their love too important, too much the only balm we can imagine that will soothe our aroused and hurting soul pain and vindicate our sense of injustice. This violates what should be a caring patron's parent's sacred code of honor. A sensitive parent fights like a demon not to impose his or her needs and longings on offspring. The honorable parent is readily available to address the hurts and yearnings of children. No reciprocity is ever expected. Such a parent keeps herself healthy for as long as sensible living can make that possible, for he or she does not ever want to become a burden to the younger generation. And wise and caring parents make sure that there is a surfeit of human warmth, caring, intimacy, and wisdom available to themselves through their attachments to members of their own generation and or their parents' generation. They have others, so they will not turn to children to fulfill these purposes. It provides positive pleasure and a sense of integrity for the thoughtful parent to set children free from having to fulfill roles either as intimate partners or comforters or the making of meanings for them. Let me return now to my trench warfare metaphor. For children trapped in the no man's land in the war zone of parental conflict, life is awful. Who would wish to live in such an unprotected environment? Unless the war stops, then, children have no sensible alternative but to make their way into one of the trenches. Which trench will be the one to which they will flee? There is a strong tendency for children to draw ever closer to the parent who is the primary parent, the one with whom they have spent the most time, the one that seems therefore to be the majority source of their stability and security. This should not come as any surprise. Children are intuitively wise. They will signal their caring and loyalty to persons who have the greatest capacity for good or for evil in their life. There's also a strong tendency for children to draw ever closer to the parent who appears to be the most fragile, either emotionally or physically. Having endured the distress of family collapse, children fear anything that appears to signal the possible crumbling of one of their parents and want to be there to lend any help or emotional support must to prop up the needy parent. It is as if the child in the scenario becomes the parent of his or her parent, trying to be attentive, trying to be loving, trying to be present and sustaining so the fragile parent will not collapse. From this perspective, a parent who is experiencing the gradual withdrawal of a child's involvement, strangely enough, might feel complimented. That may be a sign that the child drifting apart is signaling his or her trust in the to be abandoned parent's sturdiness and capacity to endure. I quote, I am pulling away from you because you don't need me like mom or dad does, close quotes. As one of the psychology interns whose training I supervised noted to me recently, the departing child can be carrying a set of beliefs, a set he or she holds in secret toward the rejected parent. Quote, I know your love for me is secure. I'm leaving your life. I may even rage and curse at you. I may never see you again. In my heart, though, I know you won't abandon me. You won't hate me in return. You will always be there, caring and waiting. I have to depart because mom or dad is going to fall apart if I don't choose him and her, and I'm not there to help. Close quotes. It could be important for separated parents, too, to reflect about what is ordinary. The distress inflicted on separated parents by the withdrawal of a child is only a heightened and more poignant version of the normative transition of ongoing life development of children. What is it that children do as they grow older? Through the elementary school years, children most typically are reasonably compliant and more willing to do, quote, what they are told, close quotes. Unless abuse or molestation is taking place, they are not likely to make much fuss about the visitation rituals of shared custody, although some grumbling is probably to be expected. All comes to change markedly, however, with the onset of pre-puberty. The challenging developmental imperative that comes to grip the child as the era comes on and expands is the beginning of preparation for emancipation and of leaving home a half decade or so hence. As children first embark on the process of readying themselves and then actively moving through adolescence, even in intact families, they begin to withdraw from parents anyhow. Parents do not need to do anything to induce what is quite ordinary, unremarkable, and even a desirable ongoing disconnection. Children increasingly are in their rooms rather than hanging out with parents. They begin to create a peer network, wanting to spend expanding amounts of time physically present with chums, and or endlessly text messaging, emailing the members of their social network. Parents are tuned out. Significant concerns and worries begin to be shared with peers rather than with family members. Adolescents press for more and more control of decision making and of time allocation, and chafe at and protest increasingly about requests for them to participate in rituals designed by their parents. Youth traversing this developmental era typically, quote, do not want to be bothered, close quotes, with the aspirations, emotional needs, or viewpoints of parents. They wish to be increasingly empowered to shape their own life choices and to keep their own counsel in an ever expanding number of domains of their lives. They also expect their parents to be selfless, to be attentive to their hopes and dreams, to provide practical help, to leave them alone when they want to be left alone, and for parents to go about parents' own business in a self-contained and sustaining fashion when children do not want to see, talk to, or interact with them. I think I will stop here because I have some recommendations for what people should do if they are now currently trapped in an alienated state. And that's a major topic to come up. And I think I've now used up my allocation of time today. So I will go back there and finish that up at the next visit. And I am open now.
I have a short question and a potential discussion question. It may actually be part of the next segment, Arthur. First off, when you're describing your experience with your ex-wife, why did she want to hear your voice?
Because that was the only way she could remain in connection with of any kind with me. She didn't want to be without a connection to me. It wasn't just my voice. I was physically present. I would say hello to her as we walked into the courtroom. I acknowledged her presence and I interacted with her, if only for a few seconds.
And why did she want that or need that?
I have no idea.
Okay.
Oh, it may only have been, see, you can't fully reject me. I will not let you reject me.
I see. Okay. The second question is in regard to kind of like the alienated parent. Sometimes as psychologists, we're tasked with the inevitable role of the reunification therapist.
Yes.
With the child or children and the alienated parent.
Yes. I'm not very fond of that innovation in the court either.
No, I guess so. The question is kind of like, what is the expectation for the reunification therapist?
The expectation is that the connection between them and the alienated parent will be restored, and hopefully they will agree to have some kind of visits and rejoin part of the life of the parent that they have rejected. That's the assignment that's given.
Right. How successful could that be?
Some of the time. There are a variety of variables that contain that. If the capturing parent fights against that a lot and denigrates it and complains about it and expresses a sympathy that the kids aren't being allowed to make their own decision and have to show up at the therapy sessions, and this is an outrage for them, and she would understand why they're upset with having to do that. Or he says, that's why I'm upset with you having to do that. That is a barrier to the successful outcome of the treatment. You have to get some kind of buy-in. The times I've attempted this, I've attempted to work with the successful parent who has the children all the time to get some greater support for this effort. And then I'll hear horror stories about really nightmare abuse of the children on the part of the parent who's attempting the restitution. That's the second variable. If there's been really horrible traumatic behavior inflicted on the children, I don't believe any attempt should be made to restore the visitation connection. You'll hear, I have suggestions for what the alienated parent can do and should do, even if there had been a monster, that might at least keep open some possibility that the child himself or herself will sometimes in the future be amenable to at least re-exploring the possibility of connection without going to a therapist.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So I don't. This to me is an idealistic thing. There's, well, the people who have written the works on parental alienation even want to make that a psychiatric diagnosis, that the child is suffering from what's called parental alienation syndrome, and not recognize that this is a family dynamic that unfolds in a context of both of the parents having to play their respective parts in order for it to wind up there, and that it's not a psychiatric problem that requires psychotherapy. It's a systemic change problem that can be brought about that will encourage a different outcome than the ones being pursued at the moment. I wish the courts would stop trying to treat it as somebody is sick and needs to work on the sickness in this deal.
Well, I have an observation. I want to make sure I got something right here. So basically, marriage is pre-World War I Europe, and it's a powder keg just waiting for the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. This is what marriage is, right?
Yes, well, no, that's not what marriage is. That's what marriages who are entering the phase of divorce are.
Oh, good thing I clarified that.
I'll have my own comments to make about the institution of marriage itself at a much later presentation.
I'm also impressed with your resiliency after having suffered the slings and arrows of that divorce, relatively quickly reestablishing a new relationship and eventually having an amazing marriage, all that stuff. It's not easy to do.
Oh, well, thank you. You gave me back a memory. All along in the last several months before marriage, I was uttering I don't know what to call it. It's kind of a left-wing party line about marriage that, and sociologists write about this, and it's been adopted by portions of the left wing. Marriage is an institution designed by society not for any benefit to the two people who are married, but it is an important institution that sustains the very fabric of society itself. It sets up an organized set of rituals for raising children after children arrive, and it sets up an organized set of rituals for dealing with property and property ownership and how it passes on after somebody dies. That is part of what being married is all about. And one should not expect it to be a place where one has personal fulfillment or personal emotional gain of any kind. And I used to mutter that to myself. And I would sound like you. If I ever left this, I'm never, never, never again going to get married. I will have serial relations with people as long as they feel nourishing and fulfilling. And if they turn troublesome, I will simply be alone for a while and then move on. That was my plan. I walked out of the front door of my house. I got into my car. I started crying, and a light bulb went on. It said, no, there's no party line about this. Marriage is not necessarily anybody's enemy in any way. You had a bad partner. You had a kind of stupid fit in the beginning. You wanted to be the noble one who was taking care of a damaged one. Her damage was very visible all around. Your damage was very hidden from you and from the world. And it gave you some benefit to be her caretaker. That was a noble thing. You were a kind person. You were a devoted husband and a caretaker, except that's all you were. And she never honored you for that. And she never fulfilled the giving of any appreciation for that. Whatever you did was being done wrong. And you were just constantly scolded for not understanding and not doing the right thing. So you burned out on that. You got ready not to be in a marriage that in some ways was an abuse when you were trying to be the noble person. And you got yourself ready to leave. You need somebody with whom the flow is different. Maybe there are women out there that could be gracious and fulfilling. You're shaking your head. Could be gracious and fulfilling partners. And you like being domestic. You like coming home to a wife She did do some few minimal things that were pleasant to have her doing for you. You liked coming home to children and to be in that domestic surround. And maybe you can put one together with a different partner and it would be okay. At least experiment with it. Take another chance. So I was ready to see if somebody, she had to be very different from my then current wife. That was the outstanding set of yardsticks I was using to assess her. And she was. With every one of my boxes, I checked the boxes and I was willing to proceed. And I did learn something. The other thing I learned is look at the high divorce rate. It's foolish to expect that two people who may fit together reasonably well at the beginning will stay static, and whatever are the things that they cherish about the other remains the same characteristics, the same values, the same behavior patterns that will continue to feel nourishing and vibrant for the rest of a long lifetime. People simply change. For those of us who don't go into therapy to change more rapidly, we're changing like glaciers. We are flowing down a mountain and we all are altering as the path of life continues. And we learn from our experiences and we learn from formal training of one sort or another. We are not the same people 10 years later that we were when we coupled up. And to hope that that will remain capable and pleasant for the participants is a hard thing to do. In fact, we're on like moving sidewalks. And are the sidewalks moving in tandem and parallel, or are they starting to pull apart from each other? It's not unlikely for a huge percentage of people who get married, the moving sidewalks start pulling people apart later on in life. And the feeling of being in distress gets catalyzed by often some external life change, like the last child going away to school, for instance, which breaks up the domestic arrangement. Somebody getting some kind of illness and not being able to carry on the same rituals they used to. Somebody wanting to either retire or enter on an entirely different career path than they had been before, which makes different kinds of demands on them and embeds them in the world in a different way. The arrival of aging parents who need to be taken care of. Something in the external surround is also changing and making people question how they're living because they begin to be in certain kinds of distress from needing to adjust to a development of change that's oncoming. They begin to question whether they want to stay in the marriage as well. And they grow increasingly apart and they finally leave. And on that wonderful note, I will say goodbye for today.
Well said. Well said.
Okay. All right.
Bye.
Be well.
I will.
See you guys.